The sound of crackling flames and panicked shouts pierced the quiet Kansas evening as Willow James clutched her mother's locket, the metal scorching her palm while smoke filled her lungs and flames devoured the wagon that had carried her hopes across 3 states. The year was 1876, a time when the West was still wild and unforgiving, especially to a woman traveling alone. Willow had never imagined she would end up like this when she left Philadelphia 3 months ago. At 22, she had believed herself ready for adventure, ready to claim the teaching position waiting for her in Wichita. The small inheritance from her late father had afforded her passage west, but now that money hidden in a lockbox beneath her seat would burn along with everything else she owned. The wildfire had come upon them with terrifying speed. One moment, the wagon train had been making good progress across the Kansas plains. The next, the horizon had turned orange-red, and the air had filled with the scent of burning grass. The other wagons had scattered, their drivers desperate to outrun the approaching inferno. In the chaos, Willow's hired driver had abandoned her, fleeing on horseback and leaving her with a panicked team of horses she couldn't control. When the wagon wheel had caught on a rock and broken, Willow knew she was trapped. Now she huddled in the corner of the wagon, watching as the canvas covering caught fire, raining burning fragments down upon her possessions. The heat was unbearable, the smoke choking. She tried to move toward the opening, but a fallen beam blocked her path. "Help!" She screamed, knowing it was futile. The roar of the fire would drown out her voice. No one would hear her. No one would come. Then, through the smoke and flames, she heard the thundering of hooves. A shadow appeared at the wagon's entrance, a man on horseback. "Take my hand," he shouted, reaching through the flames. Willow lunged forward, feeling the searing pain as embers burned through her dress. Their fingers touched, missed, touched again. Then his strong hand closed around her wrist, and with one powerful motion he pulled her from the inferno. She barely had time to register what was happening before she was sitting in front of him on his horse, his arms around her as they galloped away from the burning wagon. Behind them came an enormous crack as the wagon collapsed in on itself, sending a fountain of sparks into the darkening sky. "Hold on tight," the man shouted, his voice close to her ear as they raced across the prairie, the wildfire chasing at their heels. The horse beneath them seemed to understand the danger, running faster than Willow had ever seen a horse run before. They rode for what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, putting distance between themselves and the fire. Finally, they reached a small creek, and the man urged his horse across. On the other side, he slowed to a stop and helped Willow dismount. Her legs buckled beneath her as she touched the ground, and she would have fallen if the man hadn't caught her. In the fading light, she got her first good look at her rescuer. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and wind. His eyes, though, caught her attention, deep blue and filled with concern. He wore the dusty clothes of a cowboy, a faded blue shirt, leather vest, and worn Stetson hat that had seen better days. "Are you hurt, madam?" he asked, his voice gentle but urgent. Willow did a quick assessment. Her lungs burned from the smoke and her hands were red and blistered. The hem of her dress was singed and she had minor burns on her legs, but she was alive. "I'll be fine," she managed to say, her voice raspy. "Thanks to you, Mr. Parker, Dillon Parker," he said, tipping his hat. "And you are Willow James. I was headed to Wichita to take up a teaching position." As she said it, the reality of her situation hit her. "But everything I owned was in that wagon." Dillon Parker looked back toward the orange glow on the horizon, the fires moving east. "We should be safe here for now." He guided her to a fallen log. "Sit down. I need to see to my horse, and then I'll tend to those burns." As Dillon unsaddled his horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion, and led it to drink from the creek, Willow tried to gather her thoughts. She had lost everything except the clothes on her back and her mother's locket. Her teaching contract was gone, along with the letter of introduction from the school board. How would she prove who she was when she reached Wichita? Would they still accept her as their teacher? Dillon returned with a canteen and a small leather pouch. He knelt in front of her and took her hands in his, turning them over to examine the burns. His touch was surprisingly gentle for a man with such calloused hands. "These aren't too bad," he said, "but they'll hurt for a while." He pulled a clean bandana from his pocket, soaked it in water from the canteen, and carefully wrapped it around her right hand, then repeated the process with her left. "I've got some salve in my saddlebag that'll help. Made it myself from aloe and other plants." "You're a doctor?" Willow asked. A small smile crossed his face. "No, madam. Just a cowboy who's had his share of burns and cuts. You learn to take care of yourself out here." As he tended to her burns, applying the cooling salve that smelled of herbs and beeswax, Willow studied him. He was handsome in a rugged way, with a strong jaw shadowed by stubble and lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled often. "What brings you out here alone, Mr. Parker?" she asked. "Call me Dillon, please." He finished bandaging her hands. "I work at the Circle R Ranch about 10 miles northwest of here. I was out checking fences when I saw the smoke. Thought I'd better investigate." "Thank goodness you did," Willow said softly. I was sure I was going to die in there." Dillon's eyes met hers, and something passed between them, a connection that went beyond rescuer and rescued. "Well, you didn't, and that's what matters." He stood and looked at the sky. "It's getting dark. We can't make it to the ranch tonight, and it's not safe to travel with that fire still burning. We'll need to make camp here." "Camp," Willow repeated, the word foreign on her lips. She had never spent a night outdoors in her life. Dillon seemed to read her thoughts. "Don't worry, Miss James. I'll keep you safe, and tomorrow I'll take you to Wichita." "Willow, please," she said. "And thank you. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "No need for repayment," he said, already gathering wood for a small fire. "Just doing what any decent man would do." But as Willow watched him work, efficient and capable, she knew that Dillon Parker was far from just any man. He had risked his life to save hers, a stranger, and now he was giving up more of his time to help her reach her destination. The small fire he built provided warmth against the cooling night air, and he offered her jerky and hardtack from his saddlebag, not the most appetizing meal. But Willow was too hungry to care. They sat side by side, the crackling of their fire a gentle counterpoint to the distant roar of the wildfire that had nearly claimed her life. "Tell me about this teaching position," Dillon said as they ate. Willow explained how she had answered an advertisement in a Philadelphia newspaper seeking a schoolteacher for Wichita's growing population. "I've always wanted to teach," she said, "and to see more of the country than just Pennsylvania. When my father died last year, leaving me with a small inheritance, I decided it was time to take a chance." "That takes courage," Dillon remarked. "Most folks back east think of Kansas as wild Indian territory." "Is it?" Willow asked, suddenly nervous. Dillon chuckled. "Not so much anymore. Wichita's growing fast since the railroad came through. It's a real city now with proper buildings and businesses. Still has its rough edges, mind you, but you'll be safe enough, especially as the school teacher." "If they'll still have me," Willow said, looking down at her bandaged hands. "My contract and letter of introduction burned with everything else." "Don't worry about that," Dillon said confidently. "I know the head of the school board, Harold Thompson. Good man, he'll sort things out." Willow felt a wave of relief. Perhaps all was not lost. "And you? Have you always been a cowboy?" Dillon poked at the fire with a stick. "Since I was 16. Before that, I lived in St. Louis with my parents. My father was a banker who lost everything in '67. The shame was too much for him and he took his own life." "I'm so sorry," Willow said softly. "My mother didn't last long after that, so I headed west, figured I'd make my own way. Been working cattle ever since." He looked up at the stars that were becoming visible in the darkening sky. "It's not a bad life. Hard work, but honest. And out here, a man is judged by what he can do, not by his family name or how much money he has." Willow noticed that despite the hardships he'd endured, there was no bitterness in Dillon's voice. He had faced tragedy and moved forward, finding his own path. She admired that. As the night deepened, Dillon insisted she take his bedroll while he kept watch. Exhausted from her ordeal, Willow didn't argue. She fell asleep to the sound of Dillon softly humming a tune she didn't recognize, the melody carrying her into dreams where blue eyes watched over her. She woke to the smell of coffee brewing. Dawn was breaking over the Kansas prairie, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Dillon had already saddled his horse and was tending to a small fire where a battered coffee pot sat among the coals. "Morning," he said, offering her a tin cup of steaming coffee. "How are you feeling?" Willow sat up, aware of aches in muscles she hadn't known she possessed. Her hands still burned beneath the bandages and her throat felt raw from the smoke she had inhaled. But she was alive. "Better than I have any right to be," she replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. It was strong and black, nothing like the delicate tea she was used to drinking in Philadelphia, but it warmed her from the inside out. Dillon nodded, satisfied. "The fire burned itself out overnight. Moved east like I thought it would. We can head to Wichita after you've eaten." He offered her more jerky and the last of his hardtack. It wasn't much of a breakfast, but Willow ate it all, suddenly ravenous. "How far is it to Wichita?" she asked as they prepared to leave. "About 20 miles, Dillon replied, checking his horse's saddle girth. "We should be there by midday if we make good time." He helped her mount the horse, then swung up behind her. Willow was acutely aware of his chest against her back, his arms around her as he took the reins. It was improper, this closeness to a man she had just met, but circumstances left no alternative. And truth be told, she found his presence reassuring rather than threatening. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the rhythmic movement of the horse lulling Willow into a contemplative mood. The landscape around them was vast and open, with rolling hills covered in prairie grass that swayed in the morning breeze. In the distance, she could see the blackened path where the fire had swept through, a stark reminder of her narrow escape. "Have you been teaching long?" Dillon asked, breaking the silence. "I apprenticed with my former teacher in Philadelphia for 3 years, Willow replied. "This will be my first position with a classroom of my own." "What made you choose Wichita? It's a long way from Philadelphia." Willow considered the question. "I wanted an adventure, I suppose. A chance to build something new. The advertisement said they needed someone who could establish a proper school curriculum. It seemed like an opportunity to make a real difference." "Noble ambition," Dillon remarked, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "What about you?" she asked. "Do you plan to be a cowboy forever?" He was quiet for a moment before answering. "I've been saving to buy my own spread. Not a big ranch, just enough land for a decent herd and a house, something to call my own." "That sounds wonderful," Willow said sincerely. She understood the desire for independence, for creating something that belonged to you alone. As they rode, Dillon pointed out landmarks and shared stories about the area. He knew the land intimately, from the best places to find water to the signs that indicated a change in weather. Willow found herself hanging on his every word, fascinated by this man who seemed so at home in a world that was completely foreign to her. Around midday, as Dillon had predicted, they crested a hill and saw Wichita spread out before them. It was larger than Willow had expected, with wooden buildings lining proper streets and the glint of the Arkansas River winding through the town. Smoke rose from chimneys, and even from a distance, she could see people moving about their business. "Welcome to Wichita," Dillon said, guiding his horse down the hill toward the town. As they rode down the main street, Willow was aware of curious glances from townspeople. A woman riding double with a cowboy, her dress singed and dirty, was bound to attract attention. She felt a blush rise to her cheeks, wondering what they must think of her. Dillon seemed unbothered by the stares. He nodded to people he knew, occasionally calling out a greeting. It was clear he was respected in town. He brought the horse to a stop in front of a 2-story building with a sign that read Wichita School Board and Town Hall. "This is where you need to go," he said, dismounting and then helping her down. "Harold Thompson's office is inside. He'll help you sort everything out." Willow suddenly felt reluctant to leave Dillon's side. He had been her lifeline since pulling her from the burning wagon, and the thought of facing this new town alone was daunting. Dillon seemed to sense her hesitation. "Would you like me to go in with you?" he asked gently. Relief washed over her. "If you wouldn't mind," she said. "Just until I've explained the situation." Dillon tied his horse to the hitching post, and they entered the building together. Inside, a clerk directed them to a door marked Harold Thompson, School Board Chairman. Dillon knocked, and a voice called for them to enter. Harold Thompson was a portly man with mutton-chop sideburns and spectacles perched on his nose. He looked up from his desk with surprise as Dillon and Willow entered. "Dillon Parker, what brings you to town?" Then his gaze fell on Willow, taking in her disheveled appearance and bandaged hands. "And who might this be?" "Harold, this is Miss Willow James," Dillon said. "She was supposed to be your new schoolteacher, but she ran into some trouble on the way." Recognition dawned on Thompson's face. "Miss James, we've been expecting you. Your wagon train was due yesterday." His expression turned to concern. "What happened?" Willow explained about the wildfire, the abandoned wagon, and how Dillon had rescued her. "All my belongings were destroyed," she concluded, "including my teaching contract and letter of introduction." Thompson waved away her concern. "Don't worry about that. We have copies of all the paperwork here. The important thing is that you're safe." He looked at Dillon with newfound respect. "Thanks to Mr. Parker's heroism." "Just happened to be in the right place," Dillon said modestly. Thompson turned his attention back to Willow. "You must be exhausted, Miss James. The school doesn't start for another week, so you have time to recover and get settled. We've arranged for you to stay at Mrs. Abernathy's boarding house. It's respectable and clean, and she serves the best meals in town." "That's very kind," Willow said, "but I've lost all my money as well. I'm not sure how I'll pay for lodging until I receive my first month's salary." "The school board will advance you some funds," Thompson assured her. "Consider it part of your relocation package. We're just glad you made it here safely." As Thompson wrote out a note to Mrs. Abernathy and a voucher for the advance, Willow felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had been so worried about arriving penniless and without credentials, but it seemed the people of Wichita were more understanding than she had anticipated. With the paperwork completed, Thompson stood to shake her hand. "Welcome to Wichita, Miss James. Despite your difficult journey, I hope you'll be happy here." Outside the town hall, Willow turned to Dillon. "Thank you for everything. I don't know what I would have done without your help." Dillon shifted uncomfortably, hat in hand. "It was nothing, Miss James. I should be getting back to the ranch now." Willow felt a pang of disappointment. She had known, of course, that they would part ways once they reached town, but the prospect suddenly seemed unbearable. "Will I see you again?" she asked, then blushed at her boldness. A slow smile spread across Dillon's face. "I come into town every couple of weeks for supplies. Perhaps I could check on you, make sure you're settling in all right." "I'd like that," Willow said, returning his smile. With a tip of his hat, Dillon mounted his horse. "Until then, Miss James." "Until then, Mr. Parker," she replied, watching as he rode away, his figure gradually diminishing as he headed out of town. Mrs. Abernathy's boarding house turned out to be a tidy two-story building on a quiet street 3 blocks from the school. The landlady, a plump widow with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, read Thompson's note and immediately took Willow under her wing. "You poor dear," she clucked, leading Willow to a small but comfortable room on the second floor. "Caught in a wildfire. You'll need new clothes, of course. I'll send for the seamstress right away." The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Mrs. Abernathy introduced Willow to the seamstress, who took measurements and promised 2 new dresses by the end of the week. The general store proprietor extended credit so she could purchase basic necessities. Thompson gave her a tour of the schoolhouse, a 1-room building with rows of desks, a pot-bellied stove, and shelves of well-worn books. Everywhere she went, people were kind and welcoming, but Willow couldn't help looking for a certain cowboy whenever she ventured into town. Despite her busy days, her thoughts frequently returned to Dillon Parker, his blue eyes, his gentle hands tending her burns, the safety she had felt in his presence. A week after her arrival, Willow stood at the front of the schoolhouse, facing 20 pairs of curious eyes. Children ranging from 6 to 16 filled the desks, dressed in their Sunday best for the first day of school. Her hands, nearly healed now, trembled slightly as she picked up the chalk. "Good morning," she said, writing her name on the blackboard. "I'm Miss James, your new teacher. I'm looking forward to getting to know each of you." By lunchtime, Willow had learned all their names and had begun to assess their various levels of education. Some of the older boys were clearly there under duress, more interested in ranch work than books, while others showed genuine enthusiasm for learning. The younger children were full of energy and questions, especially about her journey west. When school let out for the day, Willow stayed behind to prepare lessons for the following day. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear the footsteps approaching the schoolhouse door. "Miss James." She looked up, startled, to see Dillon Parker standing in the doorway, hat in hand. He wore a clean shirt and had trimmed his beard, but his eyes were the same deep blue that had haunted her dreams. "Mr. Parker." Willow stood, unable to contain her smile. "What a pleasant surprise." "I finished my work at the ranch earlier than expected," he said, stepping into the schoolhouse. "Thought I'd come see how you're settling in." "Very well, thank you." Willow gestured around the schoolroom. "Today was my first day with the students." Dillon nodded approvingly. "They're lucky to have you." He hesitated, then added, "I was wondering if you might join me for supper at the hotel restaurant to celebrate your first day of teaching." Willow knew she should decline. Proper young women didn't dine alone with men to whom they weren't related or engaged. But this was the West, where many of the strict social rules of Eastern society seemed less important, and after what they had been through together, surely a meal in a public place would be acceptable. "I'd be delighted," she said. The hotel restaurant was the finest establishment in Wichita, with tablecloths and proper china. As they ate, Dillon told her about his work at the Circle R Ranch, and Willow shared stories from her first day of teaching. Their conversation flowed easily, as if they had known each other for years instead of days. "I never properly thanked you," Willow said as they finished their meal, "for saving my life." Dillon's eyes met hers across the table. "You don't need to thank me, Miss James." "Willow," she reminded him softly. "Willow," he repeated, the sound of her name on his lips sending a shiver down her spine. After dinner, he walked her back to the boarding house. At the front gate, they paused, reluctant to part ways. "When will you be in town again?" Willow asked. 2 weeks, Dillon replied. "But—" he hesitated. "Would it be too forward of me to call on you this Sunday? I could show you around the area if you'd like." Willow knew she should take more time to consider to maintain a proper distance, but her heart had already decided. "I'd like that very much." Sunday couldn't come fast enough. When Dillon arrived at the boarding house driving a borrowed buggy, Willow was waiting, dressed in her new blue gingham dress, a bonnet shielding her face from the sun. "Mrs. Abernathy gave them a knowing look as they left, but said nothing. Dillon took her along the Arkansas River, pointing out places of interest and introducing her to the beauty of the Kansas landscape. They stopped for a picnic lunch in a grove of cottonwood trees, spreading a blanket on the ground and sharing the food Mrs. Abernathy had packed for them. As they ate, Dillon asked about her family back in Philadelphia. Willow told him about her parents, her father, a bookkeeper who had loved literature and had taught her to read when she was just 4 years old. Her mother, who had died of influenza when Willow was 16, leaving her with only the gold locket she now wore around her neck. "I have no siblings," she concluded. "No one left in Philadelphia to miss me. And now you're here," Dillon said, "starting a new life." "Yes." Willow looked around at the vast openness of the prairie. "It's so different from the city, so much space, so much sky. Do you regret coming?" Dillon asked, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. Willow thought about the burning wagon, the loss of all her possessions, the challenge of establishing herself in a strange town. Then she looked at Dillon and her answer was clear. "Not for a moment." That Sunday was the first of many they spent together. Each week, Dillon would come to town and they would explore a different area around Wichita. Sometimes they rode horses, borrowed from the livery stable. Other times they drove the buggy. They visited neighboring farms, picnicked by streams, and once attended a barn raising where Willow was introduced to dozens of families from the surrounding countryside. As autumn approached, bringing cooler temperatures and golden light to the prairie, Willow found herself falling deeply in love with both the land and the man who was showing it to her. Dillon was everything she admired, strong yet gentle, hardworking yet thoughtful, a man of integrity who treated her with respect and genuine interest. For his part, Dillon seemed equally smitten. The ranch foreman had begun to tease him about his frequent trips to town, and even Harold Thompson had remarked on the Cowboy's regular attendance at Sunday services, something that had never happened before Willow's arrival. One crisp October Sunday, they rode to a high ridge overlooking the Arkansas River Valley. The trees along the riverbank were aflame with autumn colors, and the vast prairie stretched to the horizon. The grasses turned golden in the fall light. "It's beautiful," Willow said, drinking in the view. "Not as beautiful as you," Dillon replied, his voice husky. Willow turned to find him looking at her with such intensity that her breath caught. Slowly, giving her time to object, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened as Willow responded, her hands coming up to rest on his shoulders. When they finally pulled apart, Willow's heart was racing. It wasn't her first kiss. There had been a young man in Philadelphia who had courted her briefly, before deciding he preferred her friend. But it was the first that had made her feel as though she were dissolving and becoming more solid at the same time. "I'm in love with you, Willow James," Dillon said, his blue eyes serious. "I think I have been since I pulled you from that burning wagon." Willow's happiness was so great she felt it might burst from her chest. "And I love you, Dillon Parker." They rode back to town in a daze of joy, making plans. Dillon would speak to Mrs. Abernathy and Reverend Collins. They would announce their engagement formally, though Willow insisted on finishing the school term before they married. "I made a commitment to those children," she explained. "I can't leave them without a teacher," Dillon understood. "That's one of the things I love about you, your sense of duty." He squeezed her hand. "Besides, it will give me time to finish building our house." "House?" Willow asked, confused. Dillon's smile was sheepish. "I was going to surprise you." "I've bought land, Willow. 80 acres along the river, about 5 miles out of town. I've been building a house there for the past month, ever since I knew you were the one I wanted to spend my life with." Tears sprang to Willow's eyes. "You've been building us a home." "Not much of one yet," he said modestly. "Just 2 rooms so far, but I'll add more as we need them." The implication that they would need more rooms for children made Willow blush, but she couldn't deny the thrill that went through her at the thought of raising a family with Dillon. News of their engagement spread quickly through Wichita. Most people were supportive, though a few of the town matrons raised eyebrows at the speed of the romance. Mrs. Abernathy defended them fiercely. "When you know," she declared to anyone who would listen. And those 2 know. The school board was understanding about Willow's plan to finish the term. Some even suggested she might continue teaching after marriage as long as her husband approved. "We'd hate to lose a teacher of your caliber," Thompson told her. Willow was touched by their support, but unsure about balancing teaching with the demands of being a rancher's wife. "Let me get through the wedding first," she said with a laugh. "Then we'll see." In the weeks that followed, Willow divided her time between teaching, planning her wedding, and riding out to the homestead with Dillon to see the progress on their house. It was taking shape nicely, a sturdy log cabin with a stone fireplace, sitting on a small rise that overlooked the river. Dillon had even planted apple trees behind the house, though he admitted it would be years before they bore fruit. "We'll still be here when they do," he assured her, and Willow loved him all the more for his vision of their future together. December brought colder weather and the end of the school term. The wedding was set for the Saturday before Christmas, with Reverend Collins officiating in the town's small church. Mrs. Abernathy insisted on hosting the reception at the boarding house, and Harold Thompson volunteered to give Willow away, since she had no family present. The night before the wedding, a heavy snow fell, blanketing Wichita in white. Willow stood at her bedroom window, watching the snowflakes swirl in the lamplight, and thought about how much her life had changed in the 6 months since she had left Philadelphia. She had lost everything she owned in that wildfire, but she had gained so much more: a community that had embraced her, students who respected her, and most precious of all, a man who loved her with his whole heart. The church was decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons for Christmas, filling the air with the scent of winter forests. Willow wore a dove-gray dress made by the town seamstress, with her mother's locket around her neck. As she walked down the aisle on Thompson's arm, her eyes fixed on Dillon, standing tall and handsome at the altar in a new black suit, she knew with absolute certainty that this was where she was meant to be. "I, Dillon, take thee, Willow, to be my wedded wife," he said, his voice clear and steady as he slid a simple gold band onto her finger. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." When Reverend Collins pronounced them husband and wife, Dillon kissed her with such tenderness that Willow felt tears spring to her eyes. The congregation erupted in cheers and applause, and as they walked back down the aisle together, Willow saw genuine happiness on the faces around them. The reception at the boarding house was lively, with food, music, and dancing. Willow's students presented her with a handmade quilt, each child having contributed a square. The ranch hands from the Circle R gave Dillon a fine saddle, and Mrs. Abernathy surprised them both with a family Bible, their names already inscribed inside. As the celebration wound down, snow began to fall again. Dillon helped Willow into the sleigh he had borrowed for the occasion, tucking warm buffalo robes around her before climbing in beside her. With a wave to their friends and the jingling of bells, they set off for their new home. The house looked magical in the snow, with light spilling from the windows where Dillon had asked a friend to go ahead and light lamps for their arrival. He lifted Willow from the sleigh and carried her across the threshold, setting her down gently in the main room where a fire blazed in the stone fireplace. "Welcome home, Mrs. Parker," he said, his voice husky with emotion. Willow looked around at the simple but comfortable furnishings, a table and chairs, a rocking chair by the fire, shelves already filled with books that Dillon had collected for her to replace those lost in the fire. Through an open door, she could see the bedroom with its brass bed covered in a colorful quilt. "It's perfect," she whispered, turning back to her husband. "Everything is perfect." Dillon's arms came around her, drawing her close. "You're perfect," he murmured against her hair. "From the moment I saw you in that burning wagon, I knew you were something special. I just never imagined you could love me back." "How could I not?" Willow reached up to touch his face, tracing the strong line of his jaw. "You saved more than my life that day, Dillon. You saved my future." Their kiss was tender at first, then grew more passionate as they gave themselves over to the love they had been building since that fateful day on the Kansas prairie. Winter passed in a cocoon of domestic happiness. Willow learned to cook on a wood stove under Mrs. Abernathy's tutelage, while Dillon worked to establish their small herd of cattle. They weathered blizzards together, huddled by the fire reading to each other from Willow's growing collection of books. They celebrated Christmas simply but joyfully, exchanging modest gifts and sharing a feast with neighbors who lived a mile downriver. When spring came, bringing green to the prairie and warmth to the air, Willow had news of her own. On a sunny April morning, as they ate breakfast on the small porch Dillon had added to the house, she reached across the table to take his hand. "I have something to tell you," she said, her heart full of joy. "We're going to have a baby." Dillon's face lit up with such happiness that Willow thought she might weep. He was out of his chair in an instant, kneeling beside her and gathering her into his arms. "A baby," he repeated, his voice filled with wonder. "When?" "November, I think," Willow said. "Just before Thanksgiving." Dillon laid a gentle hand on her still flat stomach. "I'll build another room onto the house," he promised, "and a cradle and toys." Willow laughed at his enthusiasm. "We have time," she assured him. 7 months. But Dillon was already making plans, his blue eyes alight with dreams for their child's future. "He'll learn to ride as soon as he can sit up," he declared. "Or she," he added quickly, seeing Willow's raised eyebrow. "And you'll teach them to read just like your father taught you." "And you'll teach them to be kind and brave," Willow said softly. "Like their father." The months that followed were busy ones. Dillon added 2 rooms to the house, a nursery adjacent to their bedroom and a larger kitchen with a proper pantry. Willow planted a vegetable garden behind the house, tending it carefully as her body changed with the growing life inside her. The school board asked if she would consider teaching again once the baby was older. "We've hired a temporary replacement," Thompson told her when he visited in July, "but the children miss you, and the quality of education has suffered, I'm afraid." Willow promised to consider it, touched by their continued regard for her abilities. As her pregnancy progressed, Willow found herself thinking often about the fire that had nearly claimed her life. If not for Dillon's timely arrival, she would have perished in that burning wagon, and the child she now carried would never have existed. The thought made her hold her growing belly protectively, grateful beyond words for the chain of events that had brought her to this moment. November brought colder weather, and on the 20th of the month, a snowstorm that blanketed the prairie. It was during this storm that Willow's labor began, earlier than expected. Dillon rode through the blizzard to fetch the midwife from town, returning with Mrs. Collins, the Reverend's wife, who had delivered most of the babies in Wichita over the past decade. "Don't you worry," the older woman assured Dillon as he paced outside the bedroom door. "Your wife is strong, and first babies often take their time." But Willow's labor was swift and intense. Just past midnight, as the storm began to abate, the cry of a newborn echoed through the small house. Dillon, who had been stoking the fire in the main room, rushed to the bedroom door just as Mrs. Collins opened it, a smile on her tired face. "Congratulations, Mr. Parker," she said. "You have a son, a fine, healthy boy." Dillon entered the room hesitantly, his eyes finding Willow propped up against the pillows, her face radiant despite her exhaustion. In her arms was a small bundle wrapped in a white blanket. "Come meet your son," Willow said softly. Dillon approached the bed, overwhelmed by the sight of his wife and child. The baby was tiny, with a shock of dark hair and a red, wrinkled face. As Dillon watched, he opened his eyes blue like his father's. "Would you like to hold him?" Willow asked. With trembling hands, Dillon took his son, cradling him awkwardly at first, then with growing confidence. The baby looked up at him with unfocused eyes, and Dillon felt a love so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. "What shall we call him?" Willow asked. Dillon thought for a moment. "How about William, after your father?" Tears filled Willow's eyes. "William Dillon Parker," she said, testing the name. "It's perfect." Mrs. Collins, who had been quietly cleaning up, nodded approvingly. "A fine name for a fine boy. Now, Mr. Parker, I suggest you let your wife get some rest. Both she and the baby have had quite a night." Reluctantly, Dillon returned William to Willow's arms. He leaned down to kiss her forehead. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." In the days that followed, they settled into a new routine centered around their son. Dillon marveled at Willow's natural ease with the baby, the way she seemed to know instinctively what he needed. For her part, Willow found new depths to her love for Dillon as she watched him with William, the gentle way he held their son, the songs he sang as he walked the floor with him during fretful nights. Winter gave way to spring, and as the prairie bloomed with wildflowers, William grew stronger and more alert. He had his father's blue eyes and his mother's curious nature, constantly watching the world around him. By his first birthday, he was taking his first unsteady steps, lurching from the rocking chair to Dillon's waiting arms. Life settled into a pattern of seasons and milestones. Dillon's small herd of cattle grew, as did their savings. Willow returned to teaching part-time, bringing William with her to the schoolhouse twice a week. The arrangement worked well, with the older girls often taking turns holding the baby while Willow conducted lessons. When William was 2, they celebrated the arrival of a daughter, Sarah Rose, named for Dillon's mother. She was a quieter baby than her brother had been, with Willow's dark hair and thoughtful expression. "She'll be a scholar like you," Dillon predicted as they watched her examining a colorful block with intense concentration. As the children grew, so did their home and land. Dillon added more rooms to the house, a proper dining room, a study for Willow filled with books, additional bedrooms for the children. He planted more trees, expanded the vegetable garden, and added a small orchard of peach and cherry trees alongside the apples. By the time William was 7 and Sarah 5, the Parker homestead was one of the most prosperous in the area. Dillon had a reputation as a fair businessman and skilled rancher, while Willow had become a respected member of the school board, helping to establish a proper school building with multiple classrooms and teachers. They never forgot how their life together had begun with a wildfire and a burning wagon, and a rescue that had changed both their lives forever. Each year on the anniversary of that day, they would ride out together to the spot where Dillon had found Willow, now marked by a simple wooden cross. "To remember," Dillon would say, "how close we came to never finding each other." And Willow would take his hand, thinking of all they had built together, their home, their family, their love rising from the ashes of a fire that had threatened to take everything, but had instead given her more than she had ever dreamed possible. On the 10th anniversary of their meeting, they held a special celebration at their home, inviting friends from town and neighboring ranches. The house and yard were decorated with lanterns and flowers, and tables groaned under the weight of food prepared by Willow and her neighbors. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the gathering, Dillon called for everyone's attention. He stood on the porch steps, a glass of cider in his hand, Willow beside him. 10 years ago today," he began, his voice carrying across the yard, "I was riding fence on the Circle R ranch when I saw smoke on the horizon. I didn't know it then, but that smoke was leading me to the best thing that ever happened to me." He looked down at Willow, his eyes full of love. "I found this amazing woman trapped in a burning wagon, and somehow I was lucky enough that she agreed to build a life with me." Cheers and applause erupted from their friends, many of whom knew the story well. "To Willow," Dillon continued, raising his glass, "my wife, my partner, my heart. And to the fire that brought us together." "To Willow and Dillon," the guests echoed, raising their glasses. Later, after the guests had departed and the children were asleep, Dillon and Willow sat on the porch swing he had built the previous summer. The night was warm, filled with the sounds of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. Above them, stars filled the Kansas sky, more than Willow had ever imagined existed when she lived in Philadelphia. "Happy anniversary, Mrs. Parker," Dillon said, his arm around her shoulders. Willow leaned into his embrace, content in a way she had never thought possible. "Happy anniversary, Mr. Parker. Any regrets?" he asked softly, "about the life we've built here?" Willow thought about the teaching career she might have had in a city, the social life she had left behind, the comforts of Eastern civilization. Then she looked at their home, at the evidence of their love and labor all around them, and shook her head. "Not one," she said with absolute conviction. "Every step of the journey brought me exactly where I was meant to be here, with you." As they sat together in the gathering darkness, watching fireflies dance above the tall prairie grass, Willow reflected on the strange twists of fate that shaped a life. A wildfire that should have meant her death had instead led to her greatest happiness. A cowboy who happened to be riding fence that day had become the center of her world. A burning wagon had been the beginning, not the end. And as Dillon's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining in the familiar gesture of two people who had faced life's challenges together for a decade, Willow knew with absolute certainty that some fires weren't meant to destroy, they were meant to forge something unbreakable. A love tempered by adversity and strengthened by shared dreams. That night, as they lay in the bedroom of the home they had built together, Willow whispered a prayer of gratitude for the fire that had changed her life, for the cowboy who had pulled her from the flames, and for the love that had risen, phoenix-like, from the ashes of what should have been disaster. Outside their window, the Kansas prairie stretched into the distance, vast and beautiful under the starlight, a land of opportunity and promise. And on a small rise overlooking the river, the Parker homestead stood as testament to what could grow from the most unlikely beginnings, a sanctuary of love and family. Built by two people who had recognized in each other the chance for a future neither had dared to imagine. The years would bring more children, more challenges, more triumphs. There would be droughts and floods, bumper crops and lean times. William would grow up to follow his father into ranching, while Sarah would inherit her mother's love of teaching. The Parker name would become synonymous with integrity and generosity throughout the region. But through it all, Dillon and Willow would look at each other across crowded rooms, across dinner tables surrounded by children and eventually grandchildren, and see the same truth reflected in each other's eyes. That the greatest fortune of their lives had come disguised as disaster, in the form of a prairie wildfire and a burning wagon on a Kansas afternoon in 1876. And in the quiet moments, when it was just the two of them, they would still feel the same rush of gratitude and wonder that had marked their first days together for the chance encounter that had saved a life and started a love story that would endure long after the memory of that fire had faded into family legend.